Hi, and welcome to Simple Christ. This channel is about making Jesus our master and learning to live, of course, and explore the spiritual realm and develop the spiritual fruit that Jesus wants us to develop. My name is Mark Shepard. I'm glad you're here. If you have not subscribed, I ask you to please do so. It's important. Also, hit the like button, leave a comment, share this with your friends. Just hit the share button. And you can send it via text, you can send it by email, you can even share it on Twitter or any other social media platform you are on, including Facebook. So let's talk about how we can hear from God, but understanding if it's really His voice that we're hearing. In the last two videos, we discussed how to hear from God. If you have not seen those, check those out. I'll leave the links below. Make sure to watch those because it's very important to understand what is needed to hear God's voice. But today what we're going to be talking about is how to determine whether it's our voice or if it's God's voice or if it's just something else that's just popping into our head. And those are very good questions because many Christians struggle with that. They struggle with the idea of, is it my voice? Is it God's voice? Am I just making things up? And that's very common to think that way. So if you're thinking that way, don't worry about that. It's very common for people who are not used to hearing or who have not really explored hearing God's voice to think that. And they become a little disillusioned, a little scared, in fact, a little fearful. Let me tell you something right off the bat. Don't ever be afraid of making a mistake in your relationship with God. And what I mean by that is that don't ever be fearful to the point to where you won't do something to advance your relationship with God because of the fear that you might make a mistake and get something wrong. There are many times that I have thought I have heard from God and that I really was hearing from God, thinking that it wasn't. And there's been some times in which I thought it was God's voice. It turned out not to be. The good news is the more that you listen to your master, the more you will be able to hear and recognize his voice. Jesus, in fact, tells us that the sheep will hear and recognize the voice of the shepherd. Sheep will hear and know who the shepherd is. They don't have to think about it because they're used to it. They know what that voice sounds like. And after we get to know our shepherd, our master, then we will be able to know that, hey, I know that's God speaking to me, or no, that's not God speaking to me. And so we can differentiate. But God is a patient God. God is a loving God, and He wants us to learn. And in that learning process, we're going to take steps and fall. Just like, if you have kids, you ask your child to come to you when they're first walking. They take that step, what happens? Well, they fall, right? And what do? Coax them back up. Or they make a mistake and do something. Do we throw them away or not ever want to talk to them again? Of course not. We always want to take our children back. And that's what God does if we have the right heart. So how can we tell what God's voice sounds like? What is it like? Well, it again is not a big booming voice that you hear coming from the heaven. While that has happened, I'm sure, in the past and maybe even today, it's most of the time going to come through our minds and our spirits, I should say. It will connect with our spirit because our spirit is calling out to His spirit, Abba, Father, and we hear from God in that way through our spirits intertwined with His Spirit. Before we talk about what God's voice sounds like, I would like to talk about how you can tell most likely that it is not God's voice. Let me start off with, I guess, the bad news or the bad qualities and then end with the good. Start off with a negative and end with a positive. So how can we tell? Well, first of all, let's understand that we cannot base things on emotion. We can't base on how it feels. In other words, it must be right because it feels good, or it feels like it's God speaking to me. That doesn't mean that God is speaking to you. Emotions are a very poor way of judging whether or not something is right or if it's wrong. We never want to base our decisions, especially hearing from God, on a feeling or solely, let me put it that way, just simply on how we feel about something. I have met many people who have made so many decisions based that it feels right. I felt God was telling me this. And they've convinced themselves that it was God when in reality it wasn't. I've heard people say to others that, yes, you're supposed to get rid of your spouse and go with this spouse because that's what God told me to do. God didn't tell you to do those things, okay? And I understand that there are a lot of emotions that come into play in that, but that is not how God works on the emotional level. Now, emotions may be part of our life, of course, but hearing from God, we cannot determine whether it is from God just simply on how we feel. So here are some of the things, some red flags, let's call them red flags, that we should be aware of when we are listening for God's voice in helping us to determine what is and what isn't. One of the first ones we have to look at is if it's always about finances, always about money, about prospering, about becoming rich. I have met many, many people, and I have seen many videos and heard many sermons from preachers and other Christian leaders, always saying that God told me to tell you if you just do this, you're going to be rich. And it seems as if God is just this individual, this big conscious being in the sky that's just wanting to throw money at everybody, wants to make everybody rich with new Mercedes or BMWs and houses and homes and flush bank accounts. Yes, God wants us to be taken care of, but some of the most devout, some of the most honest, some of the most loyal Christians, some of the most people most loyal to our Father, our Master, are people who have nothing whatsoever. I have traveled through Asia, through Myanmar, through jungles, through some poorest nations in parts of India, Nepal, Bhutan, and I have seen the strongest, most spiritual people being among the most poorest of the bunch. So we can't think that God is out there to make us rich. If it's always about financing, if all the time you're listening to God and all the time you hear this voice telling you you're going to be rich, it's always going to be about money, I would be very, very leery of that. I'm not going to say that God isn't going to tell you He's going to take care of your finances, or He might bless you in a certain area. But if you're always hearing the voice telling you you're going to be rich, it probably isn't from God. So be careful of that. Another one is, it sounds kind of horoscopish. Have you ever maybe read a horoscope? Not that you've followed it, I'm not saying that you do that, but have you ever noticed that horoscopes always tend to find or say the same thing? And if you take it, you can apply it to this individual. You can apply it to just about any individuals. And I'm not encouraging you to go do this, okay? Please, I don't believe in horoscopes or anything like that. But you'll find many times horoscopes will say things like, this individual, or he'll say something along the lines of, you are a very, very well-respected person. You have good friends. You are creative and like the outdoors. Well, that could apply to just about 90% of the people who would read that. And those individuals that would say things like, well, I'm not very energetic, they'll even kind of twist that and say, well, I'm not energetic in this, but really I'm kind of energetic in maybe reading. And so it twists with our minds. It's kind of very horoscopish. It's very vague. And I've heard that from many people who make predictions in the so-called prophetic world, where they make these predictions that are very, very vague. And they sound something like, if this part of the world does not repent, a big storm will come. Well, the chances are a big storm is going to come. Something bad is going to happen, pestilence. And whatever happens, those people will go back and say, see, this bad thing happened because of that. Now that's maybe more toward looking at what fake prophets are, or false teachers and those kind of things. But it's the same way when we're hearing from God. If we think that God is always giving us a message, but it's so vague all the time, there's just no substance there. It's like a word salad, a bunch of words put together that really don't take you anywhere, but they sound very holy. I would have my suspicions on that too, okay? So just be careful of ones that sound kind of like a horoscope, that really don't tell you much of anything, but sound really interesting. But when you break it down, they're really not much to it. It's kind of empty. It's very empty. Another red flag to be on the lookout for is if it's always selfish. If the voice you're always hearing is a voice that is always convincing you that there's something that deals with gratifying the self. It's always self-oriented. And not talking about self-improvement wise. I'm talking about like, yes, you're this. It's always feeding into your ego. It's making and pumping yourself up all the time, making you to, yes, to be proud, always be confident, always be proud, go get them, go take. Yes, God is going to encourage us, don't get me wrong, but there's going to be other elements that come in with it. So if you're always hearing a voice that is pumping up your ego and sounds very selfish, then that's something I would really pay careful attention to. I'd question it, okay? I would question it and see if it's from God. Another one to always be on the lookout for is fear and anxiety. If the voice is always fearful and brings you great anxiety, and it's leaving you always afraid with a lot of anxiety within the discussion, that's most likely not from the Father. It's not from our Master. Our Master is not one to give us fear and to leave us anxious. So if we are in prayer and we are listening and we hear a voice and this voice is leaving us very fearful all the time, and we have a lot of anxiety and it's bringing a lot of anxiety, that's another voice to be careful of. That's probably not God. Now, it doesn't mean that God will not hold us accountable and say things to us and maybe strike a fear into us. But if it's leaving us anxious, then yes, there's an issue there, because that's not how our Father works. Our Father is not a being who comes down and just hits us with a lot of fear and then leaves. He's not like that. And finally, another red flag is if it's condemning and there's no avenue of showing you any type of escape from that. So let's say that you are dealing with a sin. You have been struggling with a sin, and you go to the Father and you ask Him for help, and you just get to that point to where you're tired of just talking to Him, and you say, God, I want to hear you. Tell me what you want me to do. And then you listen. And then you hear this voice saying, what you did was wrong. It's wrong. It's terrible. And what you're doing, if you continue this, you're just going to go to hell. And you just really can't get out of it, can you? You just are stuck in this. You're stuck in this rut. And the chances of you ever getting out of this are slim to none. That's not the voice of God. Because what God will do, yes, the Holy Spirit will convict us. And He will tell us that you are walking in a path that is not producing fruit. You are involved in a sin. You are involved in activity that is an activity that's hurting your soul and brings condemnation to you. But here is a way out. Here is the avenue to get out of this. Here are the steps. Here are the things you need to do. And a lot of times this will be a conversation back and forth where you're saying, I don't know what to do. And God may come out and say to you, hey, well, the reason you're not doing this is because you're not spending time doing this. And well, yeah, I know I'm not doing this, but I have difficulty doing this. Well, no, you seem to be able to spend a lot of time on YouTube or Twitter. You don't have enough time to talk to me about it and try to focus on it. You see how the conversation goes back and forth? That is the type of conversation that God will have with us. Those are the things, and that's how God will respond in a way and discuss with us in situations we are going through great difficulties. He'll give us that avenue. So we've talked about these things. And again, just quickly top it off, these areas here, these 5 things, always about finances or always promising great material wealth. It sounds kind of horoscopish. It's always dealing to pump up your ego or selfish, and deals with fears and anxiety, and there's condemnation with no avenue. So how do we talk right now to God and find out that, well, it really is His voice? We're going to go to the Old Testament, and we're going to be examining a man who went through what I think is an example, a big example of what you and I experience when we talk to God. We have talked about in past videos, our idea of hearing from God is a big booming voice that comes from the sky, meaning it sounds like it's a great big thunderous voice. And yes, there have been times that that has happened, even in the New Testament. But most of the time, and I would say 99.9% of the time, it takes place within our spirits. So let's go talk to a man, or read about a man, rather, I should say, who has experienced very much and much more the things that we have, and that is Job. Job is one of those books that is somewhat mysterious, and what I mean by mysterious is some scholars think that it may be a parable or a metaphor, and that it didn't happen, but it's like a parable, Jesus giving a parable, but in an Old Testament type of setting, as they did in the Old Testament. Other people think it was an actual man named Job who actually had these friends, and this kind of thing happened. Whether it's one or the other makes no difference in that, and I don't want you to get caught up in that. What I want us to do is take the takeaways from this. So our spirits will be uplifted, so we become more conscious and more connected, I guess I should say, to our Father. We're closer to our God, we're closer to our Master, and we can learn to live from Him. Job goes through great difficulties, and I'm just going to give a summary here about Job and what happened to him. Job was a man of God. If you really, by the way, if you really want to go hear something very interesting about Job and how Satan came before the counsel of God, or came before God, I should say, go listen to Michael Heiser's work. That's Michael Heiser. Do a search for him on YouTube. He has a fantastic discussion about what took place before Job, and he breaks it down to what's taking place in the heavenly realms. It's amazing. It's literally mind-blowing when you understand what is taking place in the heavenly courts. And one of the things he talks about, and I'll just use this to dovetail into our lesson, is he says Satan came before God. Well, in the Old Testament, in the writing, the way that they wrote, it wasn't Satan, but it was a Satan, meaning a Satan. And what Michael is saying is Satan wasn't the proper name, it was a Satan, an evil being. So I don't want to chase that rabbit, but I think it's very, very interesting to go back and see what happened. So this Satan, or Satan, or a Satan, okay, comes before God and says, and God asks him, where you've been? And what does this being say? Well, I've been wandering the earth. And God says, well, have you considered my servant Job? And then this Satan, or Satan, says, yeah, he loves you and appreciates you because you do great things for him. Well, God says, I tell you what, you can do certain things. And then it builds up where God allows this being to do other things to Job. But what happens in the course of Job is he loses everything. He loses his wife, his family, he loses his family, he loses his goods, he loses his prestige. All he's left with is his wife. And his wife at the end is telling him, just curse God and die. I mean, he lost everything. He was down to the point where he was scraping the boils with shards, pottery shards. They would sit in the ash pile because that's all they had, scraping the boils off his body. Talk about going from high to low, right? Wow, it's amazing and sad to see what happened to Job. Well, Job has all these individuals come talk to him, which was the custom in the Middle East, to have family or friends come to him and talk to him. And some of them give him advice. Some are saying, well, Job, you just need to chill. There's other people that have had it worse, and other of his friends are saying, well, you must have done something wrong, Job, of course, because God would never allow this to happen unless you've done something wrong. So he goes through this whole discourse, and then Job, after a while, he is lamenting. He is really in bad sorts. His mind is at this level. He is low, okay? Very, very low. And wouldn't you be? Everything that you've had, everything that you've experienced, you've lost everything. Well, here's what really happens that's very interesting that takes place. In the middle of all this lamenting and discourse and sadness, his mind is in a rut, and he can't get out of that rut. He can't do a positive self-talk and say, look at the bright side of life. He can't do those kind of things because his mind is in this area. And that's important to remember because we're going to see what takes place, and that's going to be a key into understanding what takes place in him hearing from God. So let's look right now to what happens when Job is in the middle of this terrible situation. And we're going to look at right now in Job chapter 38. Job chapter 38. So he is all in this pain in the middle of this horrible storm. 38 verse 1. And Lord Jehovah answered and said to Job from a hurricane, who is this who devises doctrines in the words without knowledge? Wrap your garment now on your loins as a mighty man. I shall ask you, teach me, where were you when I was laying the foundations of the earth? Show me if you know understanding. So here you have Job in the middle of this terrible situation. His mind is where? Down here, in a rut. But suddenly, there's an awakening. So here is Job's mind, here, stuck in this rut, but here comes a higher voice, a higher presence. And it is 180 degrees opposite from where Job's mind is. It's like a light switch comes on. And this light switch isn't done through positive thinking and making yourself feel good. So the first one is there's an awakening. And go back and read this here in chapter 38, verse 1. Lord Jehovah answered and said to Job from a hurricane, and in some translations it will say from the storm. Who is this who devises doctrine in words without knowledge? Job was in the middle of a storm, and then he heard these words from God. There's an awakening. Something happens where Job says, wait a minute. Who am I questioning? What is this? And he's not thinking these things. It's God speaking to him saying, hey, who are you that is talking about these things without any knowledge? And he takes Job's mind from here and he brings it up to this level. Have you ever been in a position where you're so low, but you want to go higher, but you can't? And then suddenly you hear this voice speaking to you, and now you're brought up to a great awakening. You're more awake to it. You're more in tune. You're not that you understand everything, but you know that I'm in a different presence here. I'm in a different realm. That is the beginning of God speaking to you. When you're in a situation, you're in a dire strait, and you're praying to God, and all of a sudden this thought comes to you and says, wait, what is really happening here? That's the Father speaking to you. There's an awakening, a great awakening that Job has. Then for the next 4 chapters, God speaks to Job, and he describes things to Job, and I can't do it all here, of course, but he takes Job through this journey of where were you? Where were you when I built the earth? Where were you when I laid down the creations and the foundations of the waters? And he goes to this great description. And his description is so apart, so different, so far apart from where Job's mind was. It can't be Job's mind doing that because Job's mind would not allow him to do that. It's God bringing Job to the point to let's talk. Let's discuss these things. That is how our Master works. Our Master brings us to a great awakening. So when we're in prayer and we're listening to God and we're trying to determine in the middle of our difficulty or our questioning, and we're unsure and we're having some ambiguity, it's just uncertain to where we're going to go with this. And then suddenly there's an awakening to something and it brings us up to a whole new level of understanding. Then we can say, that is God speaking to us, the beginning stages of God speaking to us. The next way we know we are hearing from God is that it brings realization. We find this in chapter 42, after God had just described to Job and shown him many wonderful things that he had never thought of, especially in the state of mind that he was in. His state of mind went from one way to the next, and God is revealing these things, and he has come to a much greater understanding. And through all this process, God has changed Job, and his mind has now reached him from where he's gone to more, he's awakened to these things, to now he realizes this. Look at chapter 42, verse 1. And Job answered and said to Lord Jehovah, I know that you can do all these things, and no mind is hidden from you. Who is this who devises doctrines by words without knowledge? Because of this you showed me that I did not understand, and I have not known things that are greater than I. Hear me and I shall speak. I shall ask, you teach me. It is by the hearing of the ear I have heard you, and now behold, my eye has seen you. There are many loaded words in here that just bring in so much, and we're just going to hit them real quickly because we're not going to have time to talk about them all. But this is very indicative of what's being described by all the New Testament writers about hearing from God. Look at some of the words that are in here in this section. The first one that we read about here in verse 1 or verse 2. I know that you can do all these things and no mind is hidden from you. No mind is hidden. So God knows the mind, but God is also communicating with him through his mind, through his spirit, to his spirit. So that word mind. Now look at this verse. Verse 4. Hear me and I shall speak. I shall ask, you teach me. So God is in the process of teaching him. There's lessons to be learned. How many times in your prayer where you think you are hearing from God and you're not sure, but there's a lesson that's been learned in that? That's God speaking to you. When God knows your mind and he reveals something to you about you that you did not know, maybe arrogance or pride, as in Job's case, there may have been a little bit of pride, thinking that he knew everything of what was going on, and we're all like that, aren't we? And God teaches him, and Job realizes that. That's God speaking to you. And finally, look at the next one here. This is in verse 5. It is by the hearing of the ear I have heard you, and now behold, my eye has seen you. This hearing of the ear and the seeing of the eye is not a necessarily audible hearing or a seeing of God. It's not that Job was sitting on the ash pile and all of a sudden he heard this big booming voice and God drops down before him and talks to him. It's not that. It's the way that people in that part of the world talk and still very much talk. This is how these words mean, my ears have heard. For instance, Jesus himself many times said, he who has ears, let him hear. Spiritual hearing. His eyes have seen. Remember, blessed are the pure in heart. They will see God. Not necessarily a visual seeing, but you see him. You experience him. You see who he is. For instance, if a person says, and they're trying to describe something to you and you are unsure, and then finally you get to the point you say, yes, I see. Did you see it? You see the words floating there? No, you see, your mind sees it, you understand it the same way. So again, there was an awakening and then there was a realization. But look what happens next in this. After this awakening and realization, there's the next one, and that is direction is given. God will always give you direction. It might be something very simple. It might be something very grand. We like the grand things. God operates many times in the small because God always operates in all realms, but he operates most of the time. I'll say how God operates, but God operates many times in the small things. We like to think that God is over here working on big political matters and our problems are not important, but they are important to him. Everything is important to God. And that includes whatever problem you're going through or I am going through it. And so out of this, there comes a direction. And we read about this in Acts chapter 13, verse 2. We've seen this verse before. And while they were fasting and supplicating unto Allah, God, the Ruka, the Koshad, I think is pronounced, the Spirit of holiness said unto him, Separate unto me Saul and Barnabas for the work which I have called them. You can see this, use this here in the Aramaic. I've left the Aramaic words in here just to get you an idea of what the Aramaic scriptures look like. So here we have the early church giving direction. In this case, they're actually giving direction to the church to send Paul and Barnabas out. Yet God is going to give you direction in the discussions you have with Him, the talk you have with Him. He'll give you steps on what to do. He'll say, do this, do that, go into here, do not go into here, or stop doing this habit. And not just stop doing this habit, but here are the steps to do to take doing this habit. For instance, if you find yourself not maybe spending time studying and learning about God or speaking to Him, He may be saying, well, you need to stop using your time or wasting your time and start using it wisely. And that means maybe putting down the phone, putting down the tablet, the video game controller, stop watching TV or listening to the radio or just not doing anything and sleeping all day. So He will bring things to our mind and He will tell us these things. He'll give us direction. And this direction will be, again, doesn't have to be grand. It's just something that impacts your life. The next one is there is a reward in this. Chapter 42, verse 10 of Job. And Lord Jehovah turned back the captivity of Job when he was praying for his friends, and Lord Jehovah added double to everything that Job had possessed before. Out of all this, Job was given back his lands, his houses, his friends, and everything. And he had another family. And I mean, he describes the family as like the daughters of Job were some of the most beautiful in the world, in the area. Nobody had seen more beautiful women like Job's daughter. And what was this? Job was obedient. The story of Job is showing the obedience that he had. Now, what happened to his friends? Well, if you go back and read the verses before in chapter 42, you'll find that because of the bad advice that Job's friends gave him, God told them that, hey, these things are wrong. You did me wrong, but I want you to go sacrifice a bull of a goat. Again, direction, no condemnation. Direction, something to do, not just leaving you hanging and runs off somewhere. That's not how God works. But in Job's case, there is a reward. However, I don't want you to think that just because Job gets these rewards in the way that it includes homes and houses and all these material things, that our reward is going to be that. It might be. It might very well be that. I'm not saying it won't be. But the greatest rewards that God gives, and these are the ones that we really want to embrace, are the ones of peace and hopefulness. Think about that. Peace and hopefulness. These are the true gifts that we're given. These are the rewards that we have. Philippians chapter 3, verse 6. Paul writes, "Of nothing be anxious, rather at all times in prayer and in petition and in thanksgiving, make your requests known before God. And the peace of God, that is greater than all understanding, will keep your hearts and your minds in Yeshua, in Jesus, the Anointed One." Do you see what Paul is saying here? Look at this verse quickly again. Don't be anxious for anything. Be of nothing be anxious. Rather at all times, in prayer and in petition and in thanksgiving, make your request known before God. This is the process of talking with God. And the peace of God that is greater than all understanding will guard your hearts and your minds. So when we're in prayer, we'll have peace. Our reward is peace. Our reward is joy. Our reward is the hopefulness. It's the hope that we have. When the end of our prayer comes and the end of our discussion from God, we should have these elements. We should have the element of awakening, the element of realization, the element of direction, and the element of reward, which is the peace and hopefulness, the peace of our minds and the peace of our hearts and hopefulness. If we spend time listening to God and talking to God, if we hear His voice and we spend that time and we come to the end of our discussion with Him, when we get up, we should have peace and we should have joy. Our hearts and our minds are guarded. We've come to an awakening, a realization. We have direction, and we have peace and hope, the greatest rewards of all. Share this with your friends. Subscribe to our channel. This is, to me, is not a numbers game. This is not about numbers. This is all about reaching as many people as I can, because this is a passion of mine. This is what I love to do. This means the world to me. And I would gladly give up my life to be able to continue to do this, giving up everything I can to be able to teach others. And I hope this is something that comforts you and helps you in your walk. Hit the subscribe button, the share, but I hate to repeat those, but I've got to. Share, subscribe, and like. Leave a comment, and we'll see you next time.